Tashi Delay, and welcome to Tibet Talks. I'm Ashwin Verghese of the International Campaign for Tibet. On today's episode of the show, we have a very important, very disturbing subject to discuss. The Chinese government's state-run boarding schools in Tibet, which have separated over 1 million Tibetan children from their families, language, and culture. These schools teach in the Chinese language with a curriculum geared toward Chinese subjects. They target the most vulnerable, impressionable minds in Tibet and seek to transform them from ordinary Tibetan children into loyal, unquestioning followers of the CCP. Not only do these schools threaten to cement China's control over Tibet, but they also endanger the continuity of the Tibetan way of life from one generation to the next. Now, in response to these horrific boarding schools, the US government has placed visa sanctions on Chinese officials involved, while several governments and UN bodies have called for the schools to close. But more needs to be done. On today's episode of Tibet Talks, our ICT President, Tencho Gyatso, will speak with a leading activist who has been at the forefront of raising global awareness about China's boarding schools in Tibet. But first, I recently had the opportunity to sit down with Tencho for a discussion about everything happening here at ICT and in the world of Tibet advocacy. Let's take a listen to that now. Tencho, Tashi Delay, how are you?
Good. Ashwin, how are you?
I'm doing well. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
So I'm speaking to you now the same week that President Biden met with Chinese leader Xi Jinping here in the United States at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco. The White House said afterward that President Biden raised Tibet with President Xi, although the White House statement kind of just made a passing reference to Tibet. I was curious to know, as ICT's president, what's your response to the Biden-Xi meeting?
Yes, so as you said, the White House statement said that Tibet was discussed. We as ICT had written to President Biden ahead. We also had a member campaign making sure our members' voices also get to the president. It's U.S. policy mandated by the Tibet Policy and Support Act that the United States raise Tibet and raise the need for dialogue. And not only that, in this time we see for Tibetans a non-violent, peaceful struggle that has been ongoing for 60 years. It's invaluable when Western governments, especially the United States, raises Tibet. It sends a message to Tibetans inside Tibet that their cause is not lost and that their voices are being raised and heard. So that's why we raise our voices ahead of that every time.
So just before Xi came to the United States, China's State Council released a new white paper called CPC, Communist Party of China, Policies and the Governance of Xizang in the New Area, Approach and Achievements. So Xizang is a Chinese word that the Chinese government is now increasingly using to describe Tibet. What should our audience know about this white paper?
So this white paper, it just reiterates China's policy on Tibet. There is nothing new in it. It just states what they're doing. It doesn't even talk about the colonial boarding schools there are. It doesn't talk about the relocation. It talks about how great Tibet is and how happy Tibetans are. And this is what China's policy is. So there's nothing new in it. And you're right, they're increasingly using Xizang, and that's the policy, to erase the word Tibet and use Xizang, which means Western treasure house. and a very intensified sinification is ongoing in Tibetan areas.
Yeah, and as we stated on social media, Tibet must remain Tibet, right? An Shizong, Tibet must remain Tibet. On a brighter note, this week here in Washington, you also got to attend NED, the National Endowment for Democracy's 40th anniversary presentation of its annual Democracy Awards and Democracy Service Medals. And for this special 40th anniversary celebration, there was actually a Tibetan award winner. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I was privileged to attend. It was a wonderful celebration of NED's achievements over past 40 years, and we've had the privilege to work with them on a number of projects as well. And a Tibetan activist, Golok Jingme, he is the person who, along with Thundu Pongchen, made a film called Leaving Fear Behind just ahead of the 2008 Olympic Games, which interviewed over 108 Tibetans about what their thoughts are about the Dalai Lama, about the then Olympic Games. And it was released after that. It was smuggled out of Tibet and released, and both the filmmaker, two filmmakers, Thundup and Golok Jingme, they were both arrested and imprisoned, and they both escaped out after. So Golok Jingme was there to get an award on behalf of individuals who express courage in the face of hardship and authoritarian rules. So he was there to get that award, and I was privileged to sit with him and see him receive that.
Yeah, absolutely. Very courageous man. It's great to see him honored that way. One final question for you here, Tencho. So speaking to you this week here in Washington, just recently, you actually just got back from another trip to India, and you were there with some of our other ICT leaders. Can you tell us what you all did while you were over there?
Yes, it was a brief visit, but we were really lucky that all the heads of our offices could be there together. We had Kai Müller from our German Berlin office, Lhadon Tethong from our Amsterdam office, and Pujan Srila, who is head of our research and monitoring, all four of us there. And it also coincided that our chairman of the board, Mr. Richard Gear, was there, along with Tempat Srila, our board member, who's based there in Dharamsala. So 5 of us had a wonderful audience with His Holiness. We were able to apprise him of some of our work and also our plans going forward. We also had meetings with Sikyong Pempat, the president of the Central Tibetan Administration, the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, the Minister for Department of Information and International Relations. The goal is that ICT works even more coordinated with the efforts of the Tibetan Exile Administration and make sure the work we're doing is strategic and intentional and coordinated closely with what efforts Dharamsala is making. So I think it was very good that we could be there all together.
Yeah, and I know you also got a little bit of time to see some family and some other things in India as well, so it must have been a nice trip.
Yes, very hectic.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed it, a little bit of family time as well as work time, so combination.
Yeah. Well, glad to have you back, and thank you so much, Tencho, for this discussion.
Thank you, Ashwin.
My thanks again to Tencho for that conversation. About 2 years ago, Tibet Action Institute published a groundbreaking report titled Separated from Their Families, Hidden from the World, China's Vast System of Colonial Boarding Schools Inside Tibet. We'll make sure to share the link to where you can find the report. Now, that report helped get us to where we are today, where more and more people are expressing concern and condemnation over China's boarding schools in Tibet. Recently, Tencho also had the opportunity to speak with the director of Tibet Action Institute, a longtime, well-known Tibet activist named Lhadon Tethong. Without further ado, let's listen to their conversation now.
Hello, Lhadon. So good to see you.
Hi, Tencho, you too.
Oh, thank you for making time to join us on this Tibet Talk. It's been something we've been trying to put on the calendar a long time, and I'm glad to have you finally here.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. I think Lhadon, you're known to all of us, but maybe not to all of our viewers. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you are doing now. You are co-founder and director of the Tibet Action Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about the Tibet Action Institute and what you do?
Sure, yes. So Tibet Action came out of Students for a Free Tibet and our experience, like a whole collective of us, our experience through the years working with SFT and then culminating in and around the Olympics, the first Beijing Olympics in 2008, but also, what we experienced through the March 2008, that whole spring into summer uprising. And what we saw at that time as the need for the opportunity we had to expand our activism and our training that had really we'd done so many years with outside Tibetans, students, sort of global activism. And we saw that 2008 really changed the game, that Tibetans inside Tibet so clearly were connected and communicating and telling their own story in a way like never before from inside. And so there was obviously in this new connected world with communications technology and whatnot, we felt there was a need for Tibetans and supporters to be trained to understand digital security threats.
2008 was, just to put in context, was when the widespread protests across the Tibetan part of it.
Yeah, exactly. And so where we're previously in art, all of us Tibetans know how long it used to take information to come out of Tibet, or how second, third, fourth hand we would get news and info. And I think 2008 showed us that anything was possible really with mobile phones and connectivity and internet and people inside using these new technologies. And so Tibet Action was about technology and training and strategic nonviolence for Tibetans. So really targeting our own people in exile and also in Tibet, like wherever possible, to provide information and knowledge in Tibetan, training wherever possible that could help people stay safer online or in their communications, and also understand that nonviolence is more, that there's a strategic nonviolence kind of peaceful war one can wage, that we saw people inside using incredible tactics of nonviolence and strategies that we could see were effective against the Chinese occupation, and we wanted to really dig into that. So that's what Tibet Action, that's where we came from, and still our focus is mostly around technology and training. And it's been already too
Which
many
is that kind of training is so important because when people don't know, but Tibetan is one of the phones that is available on Apple iPhones, and Tibetans communicate really well through Tibetan language digitally. So that work and education becomes even more important.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's more possible, I think, than people realize. Of course, China has very strict control, surveillance, and things have really changed since 2008-9 for sure. But there's just more possible, and Tibetans are out there living and doing.
I was in Dharamsala recently, where Merlam AI released the Tibetan AI programs and things. So it's quite incredible what they're doing also there for Tibetans digitally. We can go on about that, but today I want to speak to you about Tibet Action Institute's groundbreaking report on the boarding school system. The report titled Separated from Their Families, Hidden from the World, China's Vast System of Colonial Boarding Schools Inside Tibet was released December 2021. Can you give us an overview of the report? Most of us, our viewers, would be familiar with pieces of it here and there, but we've never had you give a presentation, just an overview of the report itself.
Sure. Yeah. We were hearing at the time leading up to writing the report. We never really meant to write a report, but we were just hearing reports from on the ground, as you do in the Tibetan world, anecdotally, that people were talking about, having to send children away, especially very young children. We were hearing 4 and 5-year-olds to boarding school. And of course, the crackdown on Tibetan language, medium instruction in the schools, especially in primary school and middle school, places where you used to be able to learn in Tibetan. And so we were actually looking into a potential language rights campaign, and then it just became clear. One Tibetan researcher estimated 900,000 Tibetan kids in boarding schools, and that just shocked me and some of us into, if this is true, and of course the lockdown and information blackout on Tibet and transnational repression and all of it makes it very hard to know what is the full, complete picture inside Tibet. But we knew if that number was anywhere near true, it would mean, we're only 6, 7, now we know more than 7 million Tibetans. That's a huge percentage of the population, and potentially all of our children in boarding schools, which means in the care of the state, and not living with families. And so we started to go down this road of trying to look into it. And the more we dug and tried to piece together the picture, we actually came to exactly that number, almost 800 to 900,000 Tibetan children, at least between the ages of 6 to 18, living in state-run a state-run boarding school system, residential school system. And that represents almost 80%. That's all of Tibet, not just what China calls Tibet or Western and Central Tibet, but all of historical Tibet, the entire Tibetan Plateau, all areas even China considers, Tibetan prefectures or designated Tibetan areas. And it's just an astoundingly high number. And so 3 out of every 4 children, and that we knew that our numbers were also, we really tried to err on the safe side. So this picture, the up-to-date picture, would probably be even worse than it is. But that number, so not only are these children, Tibetan children in Tibet, living separated from families and parents, who mostly have no choice, that they have to send these kids because it's compulsory education, because there aren't any alternatives hardly at all anymore. I mean, there have been a limited number of private schools and Tibetan run, say, private schools, monastery schools, but China has been shutting those down steadily. And so Tibetans have no choice, and those who do try to resist are met with, strong arm tactics, threats. You will lose the right to send your child won't be able to enter the higher grades if you don't send them at these young ages, or you will lose social welfare benefits, or really, it's they may not be taking kids by gunpoint from their homes, but they don't have to, because the Chinese state has such incredible control over every aspect of Tibetan lives and livelihoods inside Tibet, that makes them able just to compel people to send the kids. And then, of course, Tibetans want education for their children, and a modern education, and they want them even to learn Mandarin, Chinese, but not at the expense of Tibetan language and culture. And that's what's happening. So the schools are not just boarding schools like we might think of them in the rest of the world, but they really are under Xi Jinping, under these sort of new ethno-nationalistic policies that he's been leading, this drive sort of campaign of sinification, across all areas China, the PRC controls. It's Mandarin medium instruction, so Chinese language is the language of instruction. So all the courses are taught in Chinese, and Tibetan children may get one, maybe two, but seems like at least one Tibetan language class. But that's one class in a day when you have, 8 or 10 classes. And then when these kids are not living at home, and Buddhism or no religion is allowed in these schools, no practice. So you have Tibetan kids essentially cut off from, but for what the state allows, any real authentic expression of Tibetan language, culture, certainly Buddhism, and on top of that, a a very serious, heavy political indoctrination program. So, propaganda. Their classes are really focused on like Xi Jinping thought, and a lot of hours, even at the youngest ages, is spent learning, Chinese Communist Party, the religion of the Chinese Communist Party, I would say. And even though they don't think of it that way, and so it's like an identity transformation school in the worst possible way, where Tibetans from a very, very young age are essentially the attempt is to turn them to replace their Tibetan identity with a Chinese one, and a Chinese nationalist identity at that, and
They're most vulnerable at that age, these young children. So,
absolutely.
what kind of impact has this been having on the families in Tibetan society?
So I should say also the report did not include, because we could find very little information about the hidden boarding preschool system. So this is just talking about 6 to 18-year-olds. And even then, it fundamentally is changing the way that these children think, and it's having an impact we've definitely heard a lot of Tibetans talking about not just the language, so how Tibetan children are speaking to each other in Chinese now, kind of everywhere, even in places that they may not have in the past, at least as a sort of a language of communication between all the kids and siblings, but also that they're being sort of pulled away from the parents, even when they do go home, whether that's, on the weekend or more likely every 2 or 3 months or maybe even longer. They're just different because they're living in such a radically different environment than they would be in a multi-generational Tibetan home. So the values, if you can you think of a more opposite value system than this socialist Chinese Communist Party driven life? Whereas if we're home, and even me growing up in Canada, I had my father there, or my relatives, to all those formative years shape me and guide me in not to kill, take the spider outside, don't stamp on it like my friends might in their home, or just the value of life, and all of these things that make us Tibetan beyond language, the obvious. These kids just don't have that exposure. And so it really is pulling them away from, in spite, not their fault, pulling them away from their families. And it does create a lot of tension, I think, in the family. That's the other thing. These kids are Tibetan and their parents are Tibetan, but their value system and their
And
social
then language
is
also,
different.
it connects when the children lose their Tibetan language, when they're taken away so young. The parents, mostly, especially the nomad parents, will not be speaking Chinese.
No, and that's a part that I think really, I think because we talk about Tibet, it seems so far away for people, and the situation obviously has been going on, the occupation and the repression, for so long. It's hard for people to imagine how Tibetans still to this day speak Tibetan and have Tibetan culture and Buddhist values and, this strong sense of identity, despite all the pressure and the Cultural Revolution and the repression and the attacks over all these years, Tibetans really have maintained a strong, core and base. And now, for the first time, we're really seeing, like, if you think of 80%, 90% is probably the number of all Tibetan children living in the care of the state and speaking Mandarin Chinese every single day away from their homes. It's like the first generation that's truly being um, influenced to such a deep level. It used to be primary schools at least had Tibetan instruction, medium instruction.
And back in the day, it used to be middle schools that were sent away, and then slowly, under Xi Jinping, I think the plan has been really to securitize and bring this education and training the young people to
Right.
so-called love the motherland at a very early. I could quote this Xi Jinping speech at a work forum that says, planting the seeds of love for China in the heart of every young person.
And it is really just straight out of the colonial playbook. It's exactly might be look different in this day and age, but the residential school system in Canada, where I was born and raised, the colonial the boarding schools here for Native Americans, Australia, for Indigenous Aboriginal people, it is how, if you want to, back then they used to just be quite blatant about it and say, we want to take the Indian out of the child, we want to make them Christian and save them from themselves. And in the process of taking young children away from their families and their language and their culture and putting them, raising them in these so-called schools, beyond the abuse and all of the things, awful things we know that happen there, they really very effectively sort of ripped them from their roots, so that even when the children went home, there was a disconnect with the family, and there were, lost culture and language and heritage that, in a way, you can never get back if it goes on for generations. And so I think the Chinese government, they clearly know exactly what they're doing, and they have designed the entire sort of curriculums and the experience of boarding school. They had themselves have said in 2015 in the decision on ethnic education, they themselves said all children of so-called ethnic minorities should live in a school, grow up in a school, a boarding school. Like they should, they should be the places that we raise ethnic minority children. So Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians. Whereas the opposite is true for Chinese students. In 2012, there was a push back against boarding schools for rural Chinese students. And the state council, that very same state council, said in 2012, actually, boarding schools should be, in theory, especially for very young children, grade 1, 2, 3, only, we should always offer local school options unless it's like,
This
very
is for mainland China.
for China itself.
Mm.
So this is you have that in 2012, and then 3 years later, under Xi Jinping, you have this push to put all so-called minority children into boarding school. So we can see what they're doing, and it's very, very, very clear. And the report helped us get, you know, the numbers and like the clear sense of how it all is working together. Because of course, that's what they obscure so well with the information blackout and the lockdown of Tibet, is like the whole picture of what is happening. It's very difficult to really clearly see and understand and reflect that with numbers. And that's what the report has done.
Pamela, at this point, I want to show to our viewers a little video that you all had shared also, that was shared on Chinese social media. Somebody who had been into a boarding school and was speaking to some of the young. Can you give us a little context of that video? And we'll share
So it is, there's a lot of Chinese state propaganda that shows you life inside a boarding school in Tibet. But this was actually just someone on social media, likely a Tibetan, but those speaking Chinese Mandarin went into a boarding school and had this sort of exchange with some students in what looks like their dorm area. There's some bunk beds, and it's just a back and forth, very seemingly just very innocent, and just an exchange with these kids about where they'd like to go and what they a little bit about them, family, or it's just what any Tibetan can feel. And I think what any person with a, beating heart can hear and see in their answers is that they're missing their families, that they are, their instinct is to say, we want to go to Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. That's where that's for them like an exciting place to go in the world. But you can see how they're torn between what is their new Chinese identity and who they're supposed to be, and also just very honestly telling this person behind the camera, who we, believe is Tibetan, how they feel about, living away from their being separated from their families. You really get a sense of, just the sadness that's underneath these sweet children, just under the surface.
你们的梦想是什么呀？
我的是老师。
我们一个一个来说好不好？来，先从你开始。
我的梦想是医生。妈妈有很多我妈生病的话很严重。然后还有带她去医院的时候，有些那个奶奶他们病得很重，还有医生也很少。然后
所以你就想要帮助他们，对不对？
对。
那我们也知道这里是寄宿制学校，对不对？平时都见不到父母。
对。很少见父母。
那你们有没有什么话想要跟自己的父母说？
我想说，
姐姐重新问好不好？给我们这下进去。想说什么都可以啊，用藏语说也可以啊。姐姐先来问，你们最想去的地方是哪里？拉萨呀。那这里有去过拉萨的人吗？有啊。
我没有去过。
你没去过拉萨，对不对？
我想去看天安门。
天安门是吧？你想去北京，对不对？
对，北京。
好，大家努力。大家努力学习，然后以后我们可以去北京，好不好？
好。
我们可以以后想去任何，等一下，老师缓一下情绪，好不好？
好。
老师也想爸爸妈妈了。
老师的爸爸妈妈在哪里？
在拉萨。我们重新问，好吧？
好。
小朋友们，你们有没有什么最想去的地方呀？
有。
哪里？
内地。
拉萨。
我想去北京。
北京。
我想去拉萨。
去北京哪里呀？
去看天安门。
是吗？好，我们努力学习，然后我们以后凭着自己的能力去任何自己想去的地方，好不好？
好。
Watching the video really puts into perspective all that you've been saying. Padma, I want to also, could you tell us, you've been working, this is not just information that you've been gaining from across the firewall, but you actually worked very closely with a researcher who has been on the ground and to many of those schools, is educationalist himself and understands the impact of this. So from listening to some of the ways he was describing also was very powerful. So can you share some of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first point that Dr. Gallo, who worked in the education system in Tibet for almost 30 years, the first point he always makes is, as long as China's been in Tibet, education in Tibet, it's been a colonial system. And there have been boarding schools for years. Now the difference is that all children, even as young as preschool, are in the school system, many of them, even 4 and 5-year-olds now boarding, so living away from their families. And Tibetans don't have control over that system. So, whatever efforts Tibetan academics like him and others in the education field inside Tibet have made over the years to try to keep some Tibetan content, or Tibetan students and professors and people have gone out and protested in the streets as recently as 2009 and 10 for we want Tibetan medium instruction. We want a modern Tibetan language education, and then of course Chinese Mandarin in addition to that. But we live in Tibet. This is what we want. And what has happened is there's, not only less and less and almost now no space for anything Tibetan in the curriculum itself, but there's this push to get all kids from the youngest ages caught up into this boarding school life, which is to rip them from their roots, to isolate them from their families, and to have, I just think of it as like the Chinese state, the CCP is raising all of our kids. That alone, anybody who has even a cursory understanding of what's gone on in Tibet over the years knows something is very wrong with a system where 80% of children, Tibetan children, are in this care of the Chinese state for their entire childhoods and lives. And that the Chinese, intention here is likely political, as it has always been in every kind of policy that they roll out in Tibet through the generations. And this is not like the previous boarding school systems where you start in middle school or a little later. If you're that little, I have a 7-year-old, grade 2, and 2 almost 4-year-olds. And I see how when we go away for the summer and they don't have a lot of Tibetan language exposure, how quickly their language abilities will go down. And then we come back, and when we're with our family and all of the people here around us, my husband's family that speak Tibetan, how it comes back up. And they're just at such risk at that young age of not losing their ability to speak and communicate, but also their psychological foundation is being cemented. Age 4 to 6 is key to the establishment of one's psychological foundation, and that's when they're getting our kids now. Not all 4 to 6-year-olds in Tibet or preschoolers have to go to boarding school, but kids in rural areas do, and that's the majority of Tibet. Majority of Tibet is still rural, so this means the tiniest, littlest school-age children, babies. I mean, I think of my 4-year-olds. They're living away from their families at a time when they're most vulnerable. And of course, no one wants to send their kids away. No one wants to send their kids away. Nobody.
Which parent wants to send their kid away, right? Yes. So not only has this report out, but you have been campaigning and ongoing awareness building about this issue has led to several governments and even UN bodies taking note of this. Can you share how that has been going, and some of the challenges and some of the successes?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is, for us, the real milestone was when the United Nations Special Rapporteurs issued a press statement about a communication that they had sent to China based on investigating the reports from Tibet, our report, and just looking into the issue. And I think obviously they found that these are Chinese government numbers ultimately that we used. I mean, the information is out there. It's just a matter of analyzing it, compiling it, and really trying to piece together the pieces to understand the full picture. And so the minute the UN said, special rapporteurs issued this actually quite strong wording, language that essentially said coercive boarding school system, forced assimilation. Then later, another UN committee, one of the most important UN committees on economic, social, and cultural rights, actually called for, after looking into this and even grilling Chinese officials, called for that the colonial boarding school, the system of boarding school in Tibet for Tibetan children, this forced assimilation policy, be abolished, which is incredibly strong language. And what it's done is it's given governments an opportunity to advocate, because it's clear that it's not just us saying this. It's not just a handful of anecdotes. The UN human rights experts, independent experts themselves are saying this is happening, and this is not only is it extremely destructive, but it's wrong. And now we have governments taking action. So including the Canadian government, actually a very strong parliamentary committee report came out in Canada recommending the government of Canada take strong, decisive action. In the US, we've had the unprecedented move for visa sanctions on Chinese officials who are directly involved in this system. And I think for us, the key here is no one knew this was really this problem existed before, and so there was no need for a solution. And China was just sailing towards, sort of the genocidal elimination of Tibetan's identity and culture and language. Now it's like we've raised the alarm. The world knows. Governments are beginning to mobilize and take action. Of course, Beijing is denying it, and they've launched sort of a propaganda campaign, very slick, media who just so happen to be allowed to walk into boarding schools and ask kids questions. Obviously not true, but that's what they make it look like. And they're denying, interestingly, they're not denying the numbers. They're more trying to justify that Tibet is such an extremely harsh environment and such a sparsely populated land that this is the only way to educate Tibetan children safely. They have to live in boarding schools, which is not true. I mean, there were village boarding schools. They may not have been, there were village schools. They may not have been perfect, but they shut them down and they didn't even bother to try to improve them. They've built roads everywhere. Tibet could not be better connected, for the rapid deployment of security forces to even the remotest corners of the plateau. But for some reason, with all the money and power that China has in Tibet, they can't get school buses and build a locally accessible school system, right? Like, so their defense so far is really to try to distract with other arguments like, look at these new schools, aren't the conditions, the facilities are beautiful.
It's the perfect Chinese way. And they had the recent white paper that they produced where we noted they didn't mention anything about the schools.
They're really, they just, I think they believe on some level, Xi Jinping's regime, that they can hoodwink the world on this one, and they really can't. And what we would say to anyone is, any place in the world, please tell us, where would it be okay to take 80 to 90% of all children starting at age 4 and away from their parents to live in boarding school? No matter what level of development, no matter what that place looked like, it would not be okay. And it's not okay in Tibet. It shouldn't be happening. And China's record in Tibet should alarm us and tell us all something very, very wrong is happening and it needs to be stopped. And I think that's at least where we are now, is sort of on alert. And that's the key. Beijing wants the world, with the lockdown, information blackout, transnational repression, surveillance, they just want Tibet to disappear. No one can talk about it if you don't know what's happening there. And I think this is the key now. We know. And now it's time for the world to take action. And I think people in the system in Tibet, like Dr. Gello, who've been fighting for years the battle to have Tibetan language, culture, identity reflected in education, I think we've put wind in their sails. Xi Jinping won't last forever. These hardline policies can't last forever. And I think now we've sent a message into Tibet again that the world is watching and that we're aware.
And these kind of government officials and UN bodies sending messages and visa sanctions from the government, these get through to Tibetans, and
they know.
Makes a difference. They know that they are being hurt. But you're right, and Xi Jinping has locked access to Tibet, where everything is being hidden.
Yeah, no story to tell, no issue, right? And that's, people say to us, "Oh, how are things? It's so quiet. We don't hear anything from Tibet." That's all by design. It's all by design. And we can't, we cannot, I think we have a sort of an extra responsibility to be vigilant on, and governments sort of media pushing harder to know what's happening in Tibet, not just sort of accepting, well, it's hard to get there. So,
Yes.
they don't make it easy. Well, work harder, try harder. It's an obligation, I think, for the international community.
I think very much so. And China's game has always been when it's so hard that people, and many journalists used to at one point also say, oh, Tibet, if you try and go to Tibet, you won't get visa, so there's no point in going. But we always, that's the game. That's what they want you to do.
Right.
But that's why it's important to try and access, especially in this time when the Tibetans inside Tibet are feeling the most pressure.
Yeah.
With
Absolutely.
all the things that they're dealing with across board. And because of this information blockage, those of us on the outside, we're not able to tell the stories that need to be told as well. But
Right.
I think,
Right. And in this day and age, I mean, everyone's live tweeting whatever's happening outside their doors and windows, or live streaming. And it's really very, it should be a sign to people that Tibetans aren't doing that really for a reason, and that's because they can't, or because the consequences they face are so severe. And yeah, it behooves us to try harder. And I hope that's what this report will help governments see, and not just the advocacy side, but this was all going on. This, in a way, the system was being constructed right under all of our noses, and we should have known. We should have known, but now we do, and so even more of a call to action. Even
and
it's
that's a message that goes out to the rest of the world also because of how China operates.
Mhm.
They do it slowly, they do it quietly, they have their tentacles that stretch out everywhere. So I think it's really time for the world to be aware of what China is capable of. When you look at what they're doing to the Tibetan children, you know what kind of a entity you're dealing with. And in that regard, I think now is a time for us to all work together and raise these issues even more.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yes.
Absolutely. And it's our littlest, it's our whole future that's on the line here. And it's makes it even more, urgent.
And we have the China's UPR upcoming, and you are all doing a lot of work towards that. I think you're working with Kai also, German office, towards that. And maybe as we get to the end of the session, you'll tell us a little bit about what you're looking, next steps, what you're doing, and what you have in the works.
Yeah, so I think, in a way, we've just begun to get attention on the issue. The there's the opportunity to hold China accountable when they're being reviewed at the upcoming Universal Periodic Review at the United Nations. So we're pushing for governments, obviously, to raise this issue, and also just to keep Tibet right up front, to let Beijing know that Tibet's an issue still, and this is a very big problem, this particular issue. But I think more broadly looking forward, the boarding preschool system is really hidden very well, but it exists. We know it exists, and we will be looking to put out a sort of a supplementary to the report, because we just didn't have much to go on to include that information in the report. So we'll be looking to sort of get attention on this aspect of the system, which really is just, 4 to 6-year-olds, in a boarding school, and all of rural Tibetan 4 to 6-year-olds living in boarding school. It's so obviously wrong. China knows it. And I think if we can expose it well and properly, it will very much help uh, garner more action and attention. And our point now would be, it's one thing to raise the issue, but let's make it costly. So what can we do? What can other governments do to join in and, issue some kind of sanctions? There have to be consequences for the people involved in running these systems. And we would say for the intellectual architects as well. It's not just the security state, it's not just the military and the police and some high-level political leaders. There are academics and intellectuals, people with international reputations they'd like to protect who are involved in
this
racing Tibetan language in Tibet, making, trying to force the so-called common language, Mandarin or Chinese, onto Tibetans. And it's a violation of Tibetan rights. Obviously, the whole system is a violation of Tibetan children's rights, family rights, parents' rights. And so for us, I think the next level should be really pushing for accountability and not letting this all be sort of a nameless, faceless Chinese government policy.
Thank you, Ajuna. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all the work you have been doing on this as well. And
no, thank you.
Also to support your work and continue working together.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lhadon.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Tibet Talks. We'll be back next month with another episode. But until then, as we always say on this show, stay safe, stay well, and stay active. Thank you, and Tujache.